in my career, I was a United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. That's basically Atlanta. And at the time, Atlanta was a very fast-growing city. And there you do see the extraordinary power that you have, because as the chief federal law enforcement officer in a federal district, in a judicial district, you have the power to decide who you're going to investigate before you decide to prosecute them. You have to be very careful about making that decision, because even an investigation, for many of us ordinary people, even an investigation in which you're subsequently exonerated can ruin your life. And this is an extraordinary power you have. Attorney General Jackson, John, I think it was the second conference of United States Attorneys, but the speech, the famous speech that he delivered to the second conference of the United States Attorneys was a very, very powerful speech. It was important in my career. It was a speech that I read. I've read from time to time throughout my career, and it's a speech that really speaks to me as a former federal prosecutor, and sometimes as a person who's on the other end of a perhaps misguided government investigation.
That's ever happened?
Yes, I've had clients. I've had clients who I think had some issues, but certainly the issues did not involve criminal conduct, and they had to go through withering, sometimes unfair government investigation, and that's when you really see the power of what Justice Jackson was talking about.
Did not occur. It's a national disgrace. It is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, you will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree.
Clarence was and is a dear friend. We practiced law together. We've gone through a lot. And this was the second hearing, if you might permit. He had a hearing, and then some issues arose with respect to Miss Anita Hill. And he was on the second hearing, and he called me and said, Larry, I want your help. I immediately flew to Washington. A team of lawyers who really were Clarence's friends. These were not the usual government lawyers from the Department of Justice who were responsible for shepherding a judicial candidate through the confirmation process. My first time doing anything in Washington, I remember we wanted to interview all the female staff members of Judge Thomas, because if the allegations against him were true, generally men who engage in this kind of harassing activity do it with other women, and it was very important for us to interview the other women that he worked with. And I was told by one of the lawyers who was in the process, well, Larry, you shouldn't do this because we're in the advise and consent mode here, and that would be unseemly for you to treat this as an adversarial proceeding. And I said, well, I don't know what you think it is, but I'm from Atlanta, and this looks like a trial to me, and I'm going to interview my witnesses. And so we did. We interviewed every single one of the female staff members who worked with Judge Thomas as the chair of the EEOC, and did a good job with respect to preparing them to testify before the Senate. They gave a very, very impressive set of testimony. It was tough. We had 3 people. There were at least 20 well-known Washington, D.C. lawyers on the other side. And people who have now gone to bigger and better things, and in the spirit of our profession, and in the spirit of Robert Jackson, some of these people who were on the other side are my friends. Life is entangled with all kinds of things, but I remember having a very tough conversation with Senator Kennedy. And he said to me, how can I trust you to do what you're telling me you're going to do? And I said, no, I've never, gone back on my word, Senator. And as it turned out, we were reaching accommodation. He didn't do, he lived up to his promise. I lived up to my promise. And we became lifelong friends. Fast forward, when I was going through the Senate confirmation hearings, Senator Kennedy was one of the senators on the panel, and my mother lives in Missouri, and she idolized Senator Kennedy's brother, and he called her. He called my mother after the hearing and told her he was going to vote for me. Something I'll always remember. You know, that's something you'll never forget. And it was an unbelievable time in the department because there are no set of books that can tell you what to do when over 3,000 of your fellow citizens are murdered on our homeland. There is nothing to explain how overwhelming that circumstance was for those of us at the Department of Justice. And I want you to understand that typically the Department of Justice, we deal obviously with, the department is an institution that deals with criminal acts. Criminal acts. Now the question that we all are still struggling with as a society is, was what happened to us on 9/11 an act of crime, or was it an act of terror or an act of war? This is a tough thing that we have to deal with as a people. But immediately after 9/11, you really couldn't, and I know I couldn't, treat this as simply a crime. 3,000 people had been murdered, and we immediately had to sort of adopt a policy that we're going to treat this as an act of terror, and we're going to have as our priority public safety to make certain that this doesn't happen again. And that's what we proceeded to do. If it's a crime, you investigate what has happened, you bring the perpetrators to justice, you have a trial, and you deal with it. But here you had 19 men who, for whatever reason, whatever evil, twisted reason that they believed in, were willing to sacrifice their lives. And you know, a trial is really of no consequence at that point. You have to consider protecting the public. And it was an amazing event. It was complete cooperation. We talk about the gridlock in Washington today. There is terrible gridlock. But I remember after 9/11, 9/12, briefing people and members of Congress, primarily the Senate. There was not one. We all were united as a people. We all were trying to do what we could to make certain that something like this never happened again. And you know, that's where we are today. It was an amazing circumstance. Now, on a personal note, when you have what happened at 9/11, you have to think to yourself, should I have done more? Should I have undertaken a more aggressive response to something that I thought was wrong? You know, you second guess yourself as to whether or not we did everything we could to protect our citizens. But, you know, we were doing our best. And I want to tell you a story about Senator Kennedy. We talked about that, and so there was an opening on the Supreme Court, and I get a call from Senator Kennedy, and he has this New England accent, and he said, Larry, a bunch of us have decided that you'd be the right person to go on the Supreme Court. Probably there's nobody better than of all the Republicans. I guess I'm the least objectionable. But he said, this was a great comment. He said, so we were talking, and we thought you'd be the person the president should nominate. And he said, do you want me to be for you, or do you want me to condemn you? And I said, Senator, if you think I should go on the Supreme Court, you better condemn me. And that was a great call. I will never forget it. And right after that call, the next day, he condemned me.